The forest of Thrace was alive with music, not the kind of music that comes from strings or flutes, but the kind that hums in the earth, whispers through the leaves, and dances in the sunlight. It was a place where the gods still walked among mortals, where the air itself seemed to shimmer with magic. And in the heart of this enchanted land, Orpheus played his lyre. His fingers moved across the strings as if they were extensions of his soul, each note a thread weaving a tapestry of sound that could make the stars pause in their celestial dance. Birds perched on nearby branches, their songs harmonizing with his melody. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath as if afraid to interrupt. Orpheus was no ordinary musician. He was a poet, a storyteller, and a conduit for the divine. His gift was not just talent, it was a blessing from Apollo himself. But on this day, the music was not for the gods or the forest, it was for her. Eurydice sat on a moss-covered rock, her bare feet brushing the soft grass below. Her hair, the color of autumn leaves, cascaded over her shoulders, and her eyes sparkled like the surface of a sunlit stream. She was a nymph, a spirit of the forest, and yet she seemed more alive than anything else in Thrace. When Orpheus played, she closed her eyes and swayed gently, as if the music were a current carrying her away. "Do you ever wonder?" she said, her voice as soft as the rustling leaves. "If the gods envy us?" Orpheus paused, his fingers resting lightly on the strings. "Envy us? Why would they?" Eurydice smiled, a secretive, knowing smile. "Because we can love without rules, without fear. The gods are bound by their power, their pride, their endless games, but we are free." Orpheus laughed, a sound as warm and rich as his music. "You speak as if you've lived among them." "Perhaps I have," she teased, her eyes twinkling. "Or perhaps I just dream of a world where love is enough to conquer even the gods." Their laughter mingled with the music, filling the forest with a joy so pure it felt like a spell. But spells, no matter how beautiful, are fragile things. The wedding was to be held at the edge of the forest where the trees gave way to a meadow of wildflowers. The entire village had gathered, their faces alight with anticipation. Orpheus and Eurydice stood at the center of it all, their hands clasped, their hearts beating as one. As the ceremony began, Orpheus played a song he had composed just for this moment. It was a melody of love, of hope, of a future that stretched endlessly before them. The guests wept openly, moved by the beauty of the music and the love it celebrated. Even the gods, watching from their distant realms, felt a pang of something they could not name. But not all eyes were filled with joy. Hidden among the trees, a figure watched with a gaze as sharp as a serpent's fang. Aristeus, a minor god of shepherds and beekeepers, had long been infatuated with Eurydice. Her laughter, her grace, her very presence had consumed him. And now, as he watched her pledge her heart to another, something dark and twisted stirred within him. The ceremony ended with a kiss, and the crowd erupted into cheers. Orpheus and Eurydice turned to face their friends and family, their smiles radiant. But as the celebration began, Eurydice felt a strange unease, a prickling at the back of her neck. She glanced toward the trees, her eyes scanning the shadows. "What is it?" Orpheus asked, his voice tinged with concern. "Nothing," she said, forcing a smile. "Just a chill." But it was not nothing. As the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of gold and crimson, Eurydice wandered away from the festivities. She needed a moment alone, a moment to breathe, to feel the earth beneath her feet and the wind on her skin. The forest welcomed her, its familiar embrace soothing her restless heart. She did not hear the footsteps behind her. When she turned, Aristeus was there, his eyes burning with a feverish intensity. "You belong to me," he said, his voice low and desperate. Eurydice stepped back, her heart pounding. "I belong to no one," she replied, her voice steady despite the fear coursing through her. Aristeus reached for her, but she was quicker. She turned and ran, her feet carrying her deeper into the forest. The trees seemed to close in around her, their branches clawing at the fading light. She could hear him behind her, his breath ragged, his footsteps heavy. And then it happened. A sharp pain shot through her ankle as she stumbled, her leg catching on a root. She fell to the ground, her hands scraping against the rough bark of a tree. Before she could rise, she felt it, the cold, searing bite of a serpent's fangs. The world went silent. Orpheus found her lying in the clearing, her body still and pale. He fell to his knees beside her, his hands trembling as he brushed the hair from her face. "Eurydice," he whispered, his voice breaking. "Please." But she was gone. The forest, once so full of life, seemed to mourn with him. The birds ceased their songs, the wind stilled, and even the stars seemed to dim. Orpheus cradled her in his arms, his tears falling onto her lifeless form. And then, as if guided by some unseen force, he looked up. The entrance to the underworld, a gaping chasm hidden deep within the forest, seemed to call to him. It was a place of darkness, of despair, of death. But it was also the only place where he might find her. With a resolve that burned brighter than his grief, Orpheus stood. He would go to the underworld. He would face its terrors, its trials, its gods, and he would bring Eurydice back. For love, he believed, was stronger than death. The journey began with a single step, a single note plucked from his lyre. The melody was mournful yet determined, a promise to the shadows that awaited him. And as Orpheus disappeared into the darkness, the forest held its breath, waiting to see if even the gods could resist the power of his song. The entrance to the underworld was not a place one could find on any map. It was a secret whispered by the wind, a truth hidden in the darkest corners of the forest. Orpheus stood before it now, the chasm yawning wide like the maw of some ancient beast. The air was cold and heavy, carrying with it the scent of damp earth and something older, something that smelled of decay and forgotten memories. He tightened his grip on his lyre, the polished wood warm against his palm. The instrument felt like an extension of himself, a lifeline in the face of the unknown. He took a deep breath, the melody of his resolve humming in his chest, and stepped into the darkness. The descent was slow, the path uneven and treacherous. The walls of the chasm seemed to pulse faintly, as if alive, and the faint glow of bioluminescent fungi provided just enough light to see by. Orpheus's footsteps echoed softly, the sound swallowed by the vast emptiness around him. He played a quiet tune as he walked, the notes reverberating off the stone walls, a fragile shield against the oppressive silence. As he ventured deeper, the air grew colder and the light dimmed until it was nearly gone. The underworld was not a place meant for the living, and it seemed to resent his presence. Shadows twisted and writhed at the edges of his vision, and faint whispers brushed against his ears, too faint to make out but too persistent to ignore. The first true test came at the river Styx. The river was wide and black, its surface smooth as glass but for the occasional ripple that hinted at something moving beneath. The water was not water at all, but a liquid darkness that seemed to drink in the light. On the far shore, the shapes of the dead moved like shadows, their forms indistinct and ghostly. Charon, the ferryman, stood at the water's edge, his skeletal frame draped in tattered robes. His hollow eyes fixed on Orpheus, and he raised a bony hand in warning. "No living soul may cross," he intoned, his voice like the creak of ancient wood. Orpheus stepped forward, his lyre cradled in his arms. "I am Orpheus, son of Apollo, and I seek passage to the realm of Hades. My love, Eurydice, has been taken from me, and I must bring her back." Charon's gaze did not waver. "The dead do not return. That is the law." "Then I will break it," Orpheus said, his voice steady. He began to play, his fingers moving across the strings with a skill that even the gods admired. The melody was mournful, yet defiant, a song of love and loss, of hope and despair. It filled the air, wrapping around Charon like a gentle hand. The ferryman's stern expression softened, and for a moment he seemed almost human. "Your music," he said slowly. "It stirs something in me, something I had forgotten." Orpheus did not stop playing. "Then let me pass. Let me bring her back." Charon hesitated, then nodded. He gestured to the boat, a rickety vessel that looked as though it might sink at any moment. "Very well. But know this, Orpheus. The underworld is not kind to the living. It will test you in ways you cannot imagine." Orpheus stepped into the boat, his heart pounding. As Charon pulled them across the river, the whispers grew louder, more insistent. They seemed to come from the water itself, voices of the dead pleading for release, for remembrance. Orpheus closed his eyes and played louder, drowning them out with his music. The far shore was a desolate plain, the ground cracked and dry, the sky a featureless gray. The fields of asphodel stretched endlessly in every direction, dotted with the faint shapes of the dead. They wandered aimlessly, their faces blank, their eyes empty. Orpheus walked among them, his lyre silent now. He searched for Eurydice, calling her name, but the dead did not respond. They were lost in their own worlds, trapped in a limbo of indifference. As he pressed on, the air grew heavier, and the ground beneath his feet began to tremble. A low growl echoed through the plain, growing louder until it became a roar. Orpheus turned to see the Furies descending upon him, their wings black as night, their eyes burning with rage. "You dare trespass here, mortal?" one of them shrieked, her voice like the screech of metal. "The underworld is no place for the living." Orpheus raised his lyre, his fingers trembling but determined. He played a song of defiance, the notes sharp and piercing. The Furies hesitated, their wings beating the air as they circled him like vultures. "Your music will not save you," another Fury hissed. "You think your love is stronger than death? You are a fool." But Orpheus did not stop. He played, with all the passion and pain in his heart, the music weaving a barrier around him. The Furies screamed in frustration, their claws slashing at the air, but they could not reach him. Finally, they retreated, their forms dissolving into the shadows. Orpheus sank to his knees, his breath coming in ragged gasps. He had faced the Furies and survived, but he knew this was only the beginning. The next trial came in the form of Tartarus. The fiery pits of the underworld were a place of punishment, where the wicked were tormented for eternity. The air was thick, with smoke and the stench of burning flesh, and the screams of the damned echoed endlessly. Orpheus pressed on, his lyre clutched tightly. The heat was unbearable, and the ground beneath his feet was hot enough to blister his skin. He played as he walked, the music a lifeline in the chaos. As he passed through the flames, he saw them, the souls of the damned, their faces twisted in agony. They reached out to him, their voices pleading for mercy, for release. Orpheus felt their pain, their despair, and it threatened to overwhelm him. But he could not stop. He had to find Eurydice. Finally, he reached Elysium, the paradise of the virtuous was a stark contrast to the horrors he had faced. The air was warm and sweet, the ground soft beneath his feet. The souls here were at peace, their faces serene, their eyes filled with light. And there, among them, was Eurydice. She stood at the edge of a crystal-clear stream, her hair glowing like sunlight, her eyes bright with life. Orpheus's heart leapt at the sight of her, and he rushed forward, his lyre forgotten. "Eurydice," he called, his voice trembling with emotion. She turned to him, her smile radiant. "Orpheus," she said, her voice like music. "You came for me." He reached for her, but she stepped back, her expression sad. "You cannot touch me," she said. "Not yet." Orpheus's heart sank. "What do you mean?" "You must face Hades," she said. "Only he can grant my release. But beware, Orpheus, the king of the underworld is not easily moved." Orpheus nodded, his resolve hardening. "I will face him. For you, I will face anything." Eurydice smiled, her eyes filled with love. "Then go, my love. And remember, do not look back, no matter what." Orpheus left Elysium, his heart heavy but determined. He had found Eurydice, but the hardest trial was yet to come. As he made his way to the throne of Hades, the whispers returned, louder now, more insistent. They seemed to come from all around him, voices of doubt and fear urging him to turn back, to give up. But Orpheus did not listen. He played his lyre, the music a shield against the darkness, and pressed on. The throne room of Hades was vast and imposing, the walls carved from black stone, the air thick with the scent of incense and decay. Hades sat upon his throne, his expression cold and unyielding. Beside him stood Persephone, her eyes filled with a mixture of curiosity and pity. Orpheus stepped forward, his lyre in hand. "Lord Hades," he said, his voice steady, "I have come to ask for the return of my love, Eurydice." Hades regarded him with a gaze as sharp as a blade. "You ask much, mortal. The dead do not return. That is the law." Orpheus began to play. The melody was unlike anything he had ever played before, a song of love and loss, of hope and despair. It filled the throne room, wrapping around Hades and Persephone like a gentle hand. For a moment there was silence. Then Hades spoke. "Very well," he said, his voice softer now. "I will grant your request, but there is a condition." Orpheus's heart leapt. "Name it." "You must lead Eurydice out of the underworld," Hades said. "But you must not look back at her until you reach the surface. If you do, she will be lost to you forever." Orpheus nodded, his resolve unwavering. "I understand." Hades gestured to the shadows, and Eurydice stepped forward, her form faint and ghostly. She smiled at Orpheus, her eyes filled with love. "Go," Hades said, "and remember, do not look back." Orpheus turned and began the ascent, Eurydice following silently behind him. The journey was fraught with tension, the whispers growing louder, the shadows closing in. But Orpheus did not look back. Not yet. The chapter ends with Orpheus and Eurydice beginning their ascent, the tension palpable, the stakes higher than ever. The audience is left on the edge of their seats, eager to see if Orpheus can resist the temptation to look back, and what will happen if he does. The path out of the underworld was darker than Orpheus remembered. The air was thick with a silence, so profound it felt like a weight pressing against his chest. Behind him he could feel Eurydice's presence, a faint, almost imperceptible warmth that kept him moving forward. He dared not speak, dared not call out to her. Hades' warning echoed in his mind like a drumbeat. Do not look back. Do not look back. The whispers began almost immediately. At first they were faint, like the rustle of leaves in a distant forest. But as Orpheus pressed on, they grew louder, more insistent. They seemed to come from all around him, voices of doubt and fear, weaving a tapestry of despair. "She's not there," one voice hissed. "You're alone. You've always been alone." "Do you really think Hades would let her go?" Another sneered. "You're a fool, Orpheus. A fool to believe in love." Orpheus clenched his jaw and tightened his grip on his lyre. He played a soft melody, the notes trembling in the air, a fragile shield against the whispers. But the music seemed to anger them, and the voices grew louder, more vicious. "Look back," they urged. "Just once. Just to be sure." Orpheus shook his head, his heart pounding. He focused on the path ahead, on the faint glimmer of light that marked the surface. He could feel Eurydice's presence behind him, her footsteps silent but steady. She was there. She had to be. The journey grew harder with every step. The path narrowed, the walls of the tunnel closing in until they seemed to press against his shoulders. The air grew colder, and the light ahead flickered like a dying flame. Orpheus's breath came in ragged gasps, his legs aching with the effort of climbing, and still the whispers followed. "What if she's gone?" one voice taunted. "What if she never followed you at all?" "You'll never know unless you look," another added. "Just one glance, what harm could it do?" Orpheus's resolve wavered. The doubts crept in, insidious and relentless. What if the whispers were right? What if Eurydice wasn't there? What if this was all a cruel trick, a punishment for his arrogance? He tightened his grip on his lyre and played louder, the melody a desperate plea for strength. But the whispers only grew louder, more insistent. "Look back," they urged. "Look back and see the truth." The light grew brighter, the surface so close he could almost feel the warmth of the sun on his skin. Orpheus's heart leapt with hope. He was almost there, almost free. And then he heard it, a faint, almost imperceptible sound, a stumble, a gasp. Orpheus froze, his heart pounding in his chest. Had Eurydice fallen? Was she hurt? "Look back," the whispers urged, their voices almost gentle now. "Just to be sure. Just to know she's still there." Orpheus hesitated, his mind racing. He couldn't look back, he couldn't. But what if she needed him? What if she was in pain? The whispers grew louder, more insistent. "Look back," they urged. "Look back and see." And then, against his better judgment, Orpheus turned. For a moment there was nothing but silence. Eurydice stood behind him, her form faint and ghostly, her eyes filled with love and sorrow. She reached out to him, her hand trembling, her lips forming his name. "Orpheus," she whispered, her voice barely audible. And then, before he could speak, before he could move, she began to fade. "No!" Orpheus cried, his voice breaking. He reached for her, his fingers brushing against hers, but she was already slipping away, her form dissolving into mist. "I'm sorry," she whispered, her voice filled with regret. "I'm so sorry." And then she was gone. The world seemed to collapse around him. The light ahead flickered and died, plunging him into darkness. The whispers grew louder, more vicious, their voices a cacophony of despair. "You failed," they taunted. "You failed her. You failed yourself." Orpheus fell to his knees, his lyre slipping from his grasp. He clutched at the ground, his fingers digging into the cold, hard earth. His heart felt like it had been torn from his chest, leaving nothing but a gaping void. "Eurydice," he whispered, his voice breaking. I'm so sorry." But there was no answer. Only the whispers, the darkness, and the crushing weight of his failure. The journey back to the surface was a blur. Orpheus stumbled through the darkness, his mind numb, his heart shattered. The whispers followed him, their voices a constant reminder of his failure. When he finally emerged into the light, the world seemed different. The sun was too bright, the air too cold. The forest, once so full of life, felt empty and lifeless. Orpheus fell to his knees, his lyre clutched tightly in his hands. He played, a mournful melody, the notes trembling in the air, a lament for what he had lost. The birds fell silent, the wind stilled, and even the gods seemed to pause, listening to the song of a broken heart. The chapter ends with Orpheus alone, his heart shattered, his hope gone. The whispers follow him, a constant reminder of his failure. The audience is left on the edge of their seats, eager to see how Orpheus will cope with his loss. And what will happen next? The world above was no longer the same. The sun, once warm and golden, now felt harsh and unyielding. The forest, once alive with music and magic, was silent, as if mourning alongside Orpheus. He wandered aimlessly, his lyre clutched tightly in his hands, his heart a hollow shell of what it once was. The whispers followed him, their voices a constant reminder of his failure. "You failed her," they hissed. "You failed yourself." Orpheus tried to drown them out with his music, but the melodies that once brought joy now carried only sorrow. His songs were laments, filled with the pain of loss and the weight of regret. The birds no longer sang with him. The wind no longer danced to his tune. Even the gods seemed to turn away, their silence a cruel reminder of his isolation. Days turned into weeks, and weeks into months. Orpheus became a shadow of his former self, his once radiant spirit dimmed by grief. He avoided the villages, the people, the places that reminded him of Eurydice. He wandered the wilds, playing his lyre to the empty air, hoping to find some semblance of peace. But peace eluded him. One night, as he sat by a lonely campfire, the whispers grew louder, more insistent. "She's still there," one voice murmured. in the underworld waiting for you. You can still save her," another added. "If you're brave enough." Orpheus shook his head, his hands trembling as he clutched his lyre. "I can't," he whispered. "I can't go back." "You must," the voices urged. "For her. For love." But Orpheus was broken, his spirit shattered. He had faced the underworld once and failed. He could not bear to face it again. The final blow came on a moonless night. Orpheus was wandering near a village when he heard the sound of revelry. The villagers were celebrating the festival of Dionysus, the god of wine and ecstasy. The air was filled with laughter and music, the scent of wine and roasted meat. Orpheus tried to avoid the celebration, but the villagers spotted him. "It's Orpheus," one of them cried. "The great musician! Play for us!" The crowd surged toward him, their faces flushed with wine and excitement. Orpheus tried to retreat, but they surrounded him, their hands grabbing at his lyre, their voices demanding a song. "Play," they shouted. "Play for us." Orpheus shook his head, his heart pounding. "I can't," he said, his voice barely audible. I don't play anymore." But the villagers would not be denied. They pressed closer, their demands growing. "Louder, more insistent, play," they shouted. "Play or we'll make you." Orpheus felt a surge of panic. He clutched his lyre tightly, his fingers trembling. "Please," he begged, "leave me alone." But the villagers were drunk on wine and the frenzy of the festival. They grabbed him, their hands rough and unyielding. Orpheus struggled, but there were too many of them. And then, in a moment of desperation, he raised his lyre and struck one of them. The crowd fell silent, their faces frozen in shock. And then, with a roar, they turned on him. The end came quickly. Orpheus fought with all the strength he had left, but he was no match for the mob. They tore at him, their hands like claws, their voices filled with rage. And then, as the first rays of dawn broke over the horizon, it was over. Orpheus lay on the ground, his body broken, his lyre shattered beside him. The villagers, their frenzy spent, stumbled away, leaving him alone in the cold light of morning. The gods watched from their distant realms, their faces filled with sorrow. Apollo, the god of music and light, wept for his son. He descended to the earth and gathered Orpheus's broken body in his arms. "You were the greatest of us all," he whispered, his voice filled with grief. "And yet even the greatest must fall." He carried Orpheus to the underworld where Hades and Persephone waited. "He is yours now," Apollo said, his voice heavy with sorrow. "Treat him kindly." Hades nodded, his expression unreadable. "He will be with her," he said, "as it should be." Orpheus awoke in Elysium, the paradise of the virtuous. The air was warm and sweet, the ground soft beneath his feet. And there, waiting for him, was Eurydice. She smiled, her eyes filled with love. "You came for me," she said, her voice like music. Orpheus reached for her, his heart swelling with joy. "I'm sorry," he whispered. "I'm so sorry." Eurydice shook her head. "It doesn't matter," she said. "We're together now. That's all that matters." And then, for the first time in what felt like an eternity, Orpheus smiled. Apollo placed Orpheus's lyre among the stars, where it became the constellation Lyra, a symbol of undying love and artistic inspiration. And in the underworld, Orpheus and Eurydice found eternal peace, their love transcending the boundaries of life and death. The story ends with a final thought, a reflection on the power of love and art to challenge even the gods, but also on the tragic consequences of human frailty and doubt. It asks whether true love can ever be reclaimed once lost, or if it exists only in the fleeting moments we cherish. And as the stars twinkle in the night sky, the audience is left with a sense of awe and wonder, knowing that the story of Orpheus and Eurydice will live on forever, a testament to the enduring power of love.